So we're going now into our plenary session, which is the sharing of group findings, and this will be facilitated by Brody Sigerson, who's here, and we'll have the moderators come up when called upon to share the group findings. I'd like to be mindful of time because Chief Littlechild has graciously agreed to give a closing prayer, and he needs to catch a flight. So if, and I don't see him in the room, actually. So if we can be mindful of time, so we can make that happen, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Carla. Just in our discussion in group number one, Elsa Stamatopoulos, my former boss and current friend, she said she talked about how the indigenous movement has been such an inspiration for other groups at the United Nations. And it's really, and this relates directly to what some of the people who were speaking yesterday were talking about, the perseverance and the hard work that they made throughout the years. And even though obviously there's a lot that still needs to be done, and there's so much that needs to be overcome, and the UN isn't nearly as responsive to indigenous peoples as it should be. What the indigenous movement has done is genuinely an inspiration to so many other people. I work closely with people who work on the rights of persons with disabilities. They look on the Permanent Forum with envy. They look on so many of the advances that you've fought for with envy. Youth is now a pretty big thing on the agenda of the UN. And I know many of the youth activists keep pushing for a permanent forum. They look also with envy and admiration at the work that the international indigenous movement has fought for throughout the years. So, without further ado, I'm just going to say right now, I look forward to seeing what the indigenous movement has on offer, what you're proposing for the next 10 years, because that's going to dictate our work, and you're keeping us at the UN honest. You, from a personal perspective, you make our work so much more interesting, because we support the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the dry mandate that the forum has is to meet for 2 weeks every year. That's it. Those are the financial resources we're given. That is what's expected of the forum from the member state side. But from the indigenous side, the expectations are a lot higher. And it's a pleasure to support indigenous peoples in this moment, and I look forward to seeing what you have on offer now. Carla said earlier that I had the hard job of summarizing all the ideas that are coming up here, and I don't think I'm capable of doing that. In group one, we had this amazing discussion on human rights, self-determination, the indigenous people's right to development, self-determined right to development, and equality. And I can't even summarize that, but thankfully Claire Charters can, so Claire. And what Carla said earlier, 6 minutes per group. So I'm going to be here basically I'll send you, if you're going past your time, I'll give you a little nudge. Okay, Claire.
Well, kia ora koutou. So our mandate was to look at human rights, equality and development. So we started out with a discussion that was led by the facilitators that looked at various different things, but including in terms of implementation, this idea or the need to normalise the declaration by using it, by making sure that it permeates all areas of life, including law, policy, and also more broadly into the public social domain. Then we looked at particularly this concept of equality and the idea that really the foundation of the declaration is based in equality and is trying to, and using Dean and Aya's, view of the declaration, the whole declaration is really geared at ensuring Indigenous peoples and Indigenous individuals also attain some form of equality that they haven't received because of historical circumstances. And we focused a little bit on concepts of formal and substantive equality and the need to understand equality in a substantive sense. It's not just about formal distinctions between people, but trying to understand equality in this broader sense that it requires substantive equality, real equality. So that might mean treating different people differently. We also talked a little bit about structural inequality and the need to appreciate that Indigenous peoples are often working in non-Indigenous systems and non-Indigenous environments, and that's reflected then often in indicia such as health and education and so on. We focused a lot on development also, and also on corporate social responsibility as part of our discussion. So talking about what worked and using the headings that we've been given, we talked a lot about the need for self-determined development for Indigenous peoples to determine their own development. And we looked at some evidence of the value of Indigenous peoples' self-determined economic development, referring to ideas, I think, that come out of the Harvard project that Indigenous peoples do better when they're developing in a self-determined way. We looked also briefly at Aotearoa New Zealand with the so-called, at least some form of economic success as a result of treaty settlements, although they are flawed, I think, in many ways. We looked at the potential through economic development for Indigenous peoples to be more self-determined in terms of providing social benefits and that kind of thing. We also looked at the way that Indigenous peoples' development can incorporate Indigenous principles and Indigenous sort of customary and cultural ideas into that form of development. We also looked at, as mentioned, corporate social responsibility, and we discussed that quite a lot actually because we had some special expertise in the room. And we looked at the value of the Global Compact as a pressure, I think, or a source of inspiration for corporations, and also for at the university level as well. We had a bit of a discussion about on profitability and the need to show that the impact of corporate activity on Indigenous peoples, if it's negative, can have a negative impact on profitability, or potentially not. We looked at defining costs associated with human rights breaches by corporate activity more broadly, and the need for corporate activity to take into account cost in non-monetary ways as well. But the big elephant in the room when we were discussing development was, of course, this tension between, well, for some Indigenous peoples, between a sort of Western liberal capitalist market economy versus Indigenous philosophies of the world. So we discussed to some extent that tension, and I'm not sure if we came up with any special answers with respect to that, other than to acknowledge it and to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples are often working in a system that is not their own. One thing that came up in terms of what worked was the example of IFAD, which has an Indigenous forum, which is quite influential, as I understand it, in terms of development that is supported by IFAD. In terms of what worked, we also discussed the need for respect for Indigenous peoples' lands, territories, and resources, and for their rights to those lands, territories, and resources, to enable Indigenous peoples to develop, but also enable Indigenous peoples to have control over their territories before development potentially comes in as well. In terms of transferring what might be good practices, if you like, we had a very, very broad discussion, and it goes back to some of the ideas that were discussed at the beginning, and that's the idea that the Declaration has to be normalised in everyday life throughout, and that ways that we can do that as Indigenous peoples, that we can do that through bodies like the UN, through and making sure that the Declaration is referred to, for example, in courts, and policy, in a myriad of different ways. More specific ideas, we talked about the need for cohesion and understanding what equality means, and that there are different views of what equality means and the roles of potentially bodies like the expert mechanism to do that. We also talked about the role that the Permanent Forum might be able to play with the private sector, supporting Indigenous self-determined development, but also supporting corporate activity that is in keeping with Indigenous people's rights under the Declaration. We also talked a bit about the need to train those people who are in decision-making bodies, or those people who have authority over decision-making, such as judges on the Declaration, so that these ideas around equality particularly permeate judgments, policy, approaches, and equality, as I've mentioned, to include substantive equality and addressing structural inequality, broader structural inequality. In terms of strategy, again, just to mention this idea of normalising Indigenous people's rights, especially around equality and these understandings of equality and development. Again, around promotion of self-determined Indigenous-driven development. So we got to some detail on that in terms of having mechanisms to provide Indigenous peoples the tools with which to develop in a self-determined way, including, for example, accessing capital if that's the way that Indigenous peoples want to develop. Also, that there needs to be an appreciation that some Indigenous peoples might not want to develop or join in the market economy in those ways. Fundamental, though, in all cases, is securing land rights to lands, territories, and resources, and also this right to free, prior, informed consent. And there was sort of some level of consensus that there needed to be quite strong rules around and clarity in law around protections of lands, territories and resources and free, prior, informed consent, and that is potentially good for others as well as Indigenous peoples, so others who want to talk with and develop with Indigenous peoples if that's what Indigenous peoples are seeking. And that was true for corporate social, from the corporate social responsibility perspective as well, that there needed to be those laws and certainty and norms around protecting those rights. With respect to equality, we had a deep discussion in terms of strategy of the need to make it very clear that equality, if you're thinking about equality for Indigenous peoples, we have to understand the level of exclusion that Indigenous peoples have faced and the need in providing equal opportunity and equality for Indigenous peoples to enhance the opportunities for Indigenous peoples now. We had some quite specific discussions around particular points, so around environmental justice and equality. Thank you. And for example, this idea that the pipeline, the Dakota pipeline, was rerouted after essentially what I understand is the white community rejected it being close to their territories, but then it was moved closer to Indigenous territories, and issues like that raising equality issues. We finished off with a discussion about whether the relationship between self-determination and equality, and our firm view from the group was that self-determination is needed as a means to achieve equality, that there is a relationship between equality and self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And in the interest of time, I will move directly to group number 2 that spoke about self-determination. I've gone around and asked people, I'm not sure who's speaking for group 2. So I'm sorry, I can't introduce you. So.
Good afternoon. I'm Cody Harry. I am a Dene and Numa from Pyramid Lake, Nevada.
Bonjour, my name is Tessa McLean. I'm from Penewatang First Nations, but I'm also a student at UC Denver.
So as you can see from Mrs. Charter's just presentation, that self-determination is kind of foundational in many of our discussions. So we had the task of talking about self-determination and defining it and articulating our aspirations. So we'll go through our list, and they're varied, and they are from varied ideas, perceptions. But one thing we did come to agreement on is self-determination is, we've heard a lot of conflation between self-determination used in a myriad of contexts, but we wanted to be very specific about the self-determination that we're talking about. And this is the international unqualified right to self-determination that is rooted in the UN Charter and the covenants. So we also want to be sure that Indigenous nations and peoples did not diminish any of their international character. So in articulating our rights, or in talking about these rights, we've noticed that there's been much conflation around the ideas of self-determination, conflated with autonomy, conflated with self-governance. And we were very specific that we are talking about self-determination in an international legal context. Some of the other conflations we had noticed were let's see. Okay, so And then we also wanted to approach this through a decolonial lens. So I want to go ahead and let Tessa speak on many of the aspects of our.
So we spoke about what are good practices of self-determination, and together we came up with political will. We need to increase awareness about self-determination. We need to increase participation and knowledge about self-determination. We need to expand our support group at the international level. We need to create a monitoring body to ensure nation states implement the UNDREP. We need to fortify self-determination through culture and spiritual practice or spirituality. We need to decolonize. We need to decolonize our language, such as like the semantics. It's like kind of like saying consultation versus consent. We need clarity of treaty intention and how we conceive or value our treaties. And we need to confirm that how we perceive our treaties is valid. This is the original language of the UNDREP. It's to achieve original spirit and intent of treaties by Indigenous peoples. We need to increase community awareness. We need to be persistent and have continuity in achieving our goals, such as, Discahe went to the UN in 1924, and we're still doing this work in 2017. So we need to continue. Change doesn't happen overnight. For question 2, we talked about publicizing human rights violations. We need to register all of our treaties by Indigenous peoples. So register treaties from my treaty, Treaty 2. We need to register treaties from New Zealand, from Australia, all of our treaties. We need to push for Article 27 of the UNDREP to resolve disputes between IPs and states. We also need to use Article 8 from the outcome document to be pushed for. We need donors to help us with our goals. We need 3 levels to focus on: the international community, the national community, and local communities. We also need to use modern technology to publicize issues and violations of human rights. We need transparency. So some of the times we have these outcome documents coming out and they aren't translated to communities, or they're not described appropriately to communities. There's like translation, things get lost in translation. We need to increase self-determination for all Indigenous peoples. Some Indigenous communities get left behind, and we do not want to invisibilize them. For the last question that we answered, we need an Indigenous Information Center, kind of like an Indigenous clearinghouse, and we suggested asking universities to take on this issue to create an Indigenous clearinghouse. This can also be done regionally, but it was mentioned that we have regional caucuses, such as North American Caucus, Youth Caucus, and those are kind of systems that are failing. So we also suggested that the permanent forum needs to take on this mandate and strengthen the role of distributing information to all Indigenous peoples. And we also suggested that we want this to happen in 3 years so that it can be implemented by 2027, 20 years after the adoption of the DRIP.
And those are all our various recommendations, but we compiled them. So if anyone in our group, you guys saw what we wrote down and we went through it together. But if there's anything else we missed, feel free to contribute.
So thank you, Cody Harry and Tessa McLean. Just one point, you mentioned that the need for a monitoring body, and that's obviously going to be a challenge to get member states to agree to a monitoring body. But just so you know, next week at the UN in New York, there is the launching of the Indigenous Navigator. And if you Google the Indigenous Navigator, you can find out about it, where Indigenous peoples themselves are taking on this role of monitoring member states' implementation of the declaration. They're coming up with their own indicators of well-being, indicators of development, and so on, and taking ownership of themselves. And that's one example of self-determination, I think. That's pretty cool. So I think next up, Group 3, and we have here Professor Robert Miller. Thank you.
Thank you. No, wait till I say something. I have 6 minutes, so my group said I could start with a joke. So the 3 things we were asked to look at, of course, mapping what worked. Well, we said nothing. And we spent 2 hours moaning about FPIC and the absence of progress. Okay, so that was my joke. No, we had a discussion, and so I've been authorized to talk about 4 or 5 points we thought under each one of these 3 categories we were supposed to look at. So what has worked? So we're very proud of the solid basis of standards that have been established, the DRIP itself, and other documents and events that have occurred about consultation with Indian tribes, with indigenous peoples around the world. Second, what are we proud of? The development of our own community protocols on consultation and consent with the governments we have to deal with. And most of these I will then address later. How do we transfer these, and what are the strategies for the future? So they're kind of the same things. The third point, we're very proud of the court cases that have occurred around the world. Dean Anaya, Professor Rob Williams, Tim Coulter of the Indian Law Resource Center, and lots of people that I'm not aware of, have brought litigations in various fora that have led to the advancement and establishment of the DRIP as the emerging common law of international law, opinio juris, etc. So just in our meeting, we heard about a Supreme Court decision from Nepal in 2012. I learned more about cases from the African Court of Human Rights. I was well aware of the cases we're all citing from the Organization of American States and its Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and its Inter-American Court on Human Rights. The Constitutional Courts of Colombia, I just learned this afternoon, have issued many decisions about even FPIC itself. So these court cases are the development of the principles we're interested in and that we hope develop into a more full-fledged, perhaps, FPIC in the future. So how do we transfer these good practices? That's what our 1 p.m. Session was about, right? Well, we want to transfer our own community protocols. Those communities that have developed something that works for them, let's share that. Let's other indigenous communities study what has worked elsewhere, and let's look at what we should try to adopt. The Special Rapporteur recommended check out the track record of corporations. Let's find out and share with each other corporations that really are complying with the spirit of FPIC, who are talking to communities with a good heart and with real earnestness about how to get consent and work in your communities. And let's also tell each other who the bad corporations are. Let's not let people show up who then trick us with sweet words because we don't know their track record. I can barely read my own handwriting. Let's have ongoing dialogue among ourselves. Yes, about our protocols that are working, endeavors that are working, these corporations that we want to work with, governments that work. And so where can we do that? So we thought at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. What a perfect place that we gather every year, right? But then the very last comment was, my goodness, why don't we have an internet website and a toolkit, perhaps, about consulting and getting consent that covers issues when other entities want to deal with us. So that sounds like an excellent idea, how we can share information. Let's use this World Wide Web, and wherever you can contact the web, we can transfer with each other the good practices. So we were asked 3 questions then in the session we just had at 2:30. What needs to be done? Well, this is where we pretty much repeated what we thought has happened so far that's good. Again, if I can read my own handwriting, we want to capacity build In the courts, all these courts I've already mentioned, the state courts, our national courts, the Organization of American States, the African courts on human rights, any courts you can think of. Someone suggested that we should be offering CLE trainings at our bar associations in whatever country we're from. Let's make attorneys, let's make the judiciary far more aware of the DRIP, of consent, of FPIC, and of this emerging international law standard. Second, let's strengthen our own indigenous peoples organizations. We have to capacity build among ourselves too, right? We can always learn more, do more, learn more strategies. This repeats what we considered one of the things that worked. Let's, of course, continue to push the envelope through litigation. And we have attorneys in the room, we have attorneys around the world. Let's use those attorneys to emphasize or to enforce our rights. The special rapporteur also mentioned, as did some folks from the UN itself, we have to hold the UN's feet to the fire. Comments were made that the UN doesn't speak with a coherent or consistent voice sometimes on FPIC and on the draft, on the DRIP itself, and that this is a UN obligation that all these bodies of the UN have to have reinforced that this is their duty. And then, of course, we want to share our successes and our community protocols. So that's, again, borrowing from something that we thought has worked. Then let's share that. And we already said how to do that. Let's look to the web. Let's look to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and meetings like this. So we hope the University of Colorado has a meeting like this every 6 months, right? So I'll see you, Dean and I'll look for it. We'll be looking to be here in 6 months. Time is up. How can a law professor talk for only 6 minutes? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just moving quickly to Group 4 on lands, territories, and resources. Professor Daly Salvatore.
Yeah, and I was also quarterbacked by Joe Bryan, who was going to touch upon the strategies. So very, very quickly, and I won't repeat the commentary that was just now made with regard to those advocates that are engaged. There were a number of different comments with regard to best practices in relation to lands, territories, and resources. The all-important invoking of the UN Declaration in the domestic context, in the constitutional context, and within the domestic courts. In addition, the articulation of indigenous land tenure systems, the more careful and detailed articulation of land tenure systems according to indigenous peoples in the context of the right to property in order to give it significance and meaning. That was addressed. At least within my own region, there were a number of different examples that I shared about ourselves hosting a Circumpolar Inuit Economic Summit in relation to the right to determine our own priorities for development, and looking at and assessing the capacity that we have of our own, both in relation to our traditional economies as well as Western economies. Another example of taking control over or assessing the laws and policies at the local, regional, national, and international level that would impact our assertion of control over a particular sensitive, biodiverse region in order to maintain our own food security. We also talked about, in the case of the Sami people in Sweden and the multi-pronged approach of domestic litigation, but also the utilization of the human rights treaty bodies in order to affirm the rights of indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources. There are a number of different examples that were provided to us, in particular the use of CERD as a treaty body. In relation to the to jurisprudence, another important good practice that was identified was the cross-fertilization of jurisprudence between the various different human rights regimes, the OAS, for example, and the African community as well, the African court and again, the cross-fertilization of jurisprudence, and also this practice of, in the case of the African Commission, taking a case to the African court in favor of indigenous peoples. There was a commentary about the need for a diffusion of information amongst lawyers. We also talked about engaging third parties in dialogue about especially free, prior, and informed consent, that indigenous peoples step up themselves and outreach to third parties and engage in dialogue, inform them about the rights affirmed in the UN Declaration, and in particular, free, prior, and informed consent. There was discussion about political institutions and the need for greater and increased and enhanced development of indigenous political institutions so that they can really step up to the plate in relation to the right of self-determination and in particular how it relates to their rights to lands, territories, and resources. Opening a space for dialogue within communities, and by this I took it to mean opening intellectual and political space for indigenous peoples to have dialogue amongst themselves about the content of their rights, and in particular their rights to lands, territories, and resources. And this emerged in relation to the use of the term territories in the UN Declaration and exactly what does it mean to indigenous peoples. We also talked about measures that were related to the kind of interim measures where certain areas as a strategy were declared ecological territorial areas in order to safeguard the areas from further damage or development until the issues came forward and were resolved as far as the affirmation of the rights of indigenous peoples to lands, territories, and resources. In addition, the area of ceremony and spiritual gatherings is still having meaning for indigenous peoples in relation to affirming their rights to lands, territories, and resources. There were a broad range of other things, and I'm sure I didn't do justice to all of the contributions, but maybe Joe, if you want to quickly add to the area of strategies.
Indigenous rights to really work, it has to be part of everybody's basic understanding of what the world is and who's in it and how it operates. And that can be done obviously through continuing legal education to the CLE idea was quoted, but also through communicating very clearly about the legal status of the declaration, clarity about what it can be used for and how you go about using it. As well as thinking about things like how do we get this on primary education syllabus, along with the sort of basic human rights education that a lot of kids are getting now in elementary school. We talked about the importance of translation. This is again back to this concept of territory. It's a word that we all use to come together, but when we go back to any of these communities, territory gets translated in very different ways. And this is something that people that are translating the UN Declaration into their own languages are struggling with actively, and that's not a problem. We should not shy away from that problem. We should engage it and see that as a really important way of making these concepts work for the people that need them, for the territories in question. And then lastly, we talked a lot about the importance of getting more involved with domestic advocacy, picking up on some of Walter Echohawk's messages from yesterday, acknowledging the incredible importance of legal advocacy to things like the civil rights struggle in the U.S., but also acknowledging the importance of direct action and alliance building that goes beyond just indigenous issues, so that the questions of indigenous territorial rights are not just indigenous questions, they're questions that are of concern to all people. And we talked a little bit about the sort of unique opportunity that the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline last year brought for raising this. At the same time, we talked about how even though all the pieces were there, legal advocacy, public education, and international legal action, the rights of people in question were still blatantly disregarded by the U.S. government.
Thank you, and thank you all, Joe and Daly, and thank you all for sticking to the time. So now for Group 5, Indigenous Cultures, Traditional Knowledge and Identities, Professor Angela Riley.
Good afternoon. So we were charged with discussing the implementation of the Declaration to advance and protect Indigenous cultures, traditional knowledge, and identities. We came out with about 5 major themes. We had a really wonderful conversation, but I tried to sort of distill these into 5 ideas, which we discussed and agreed on before we broke for this meeting. The first one was the idea of living culture. I think our group was very much in agreement that the best way to protect Indigenous culture is to live Indigenous culture. We were in agreement about concepts that we have responsibilities to know our own communities, to speak our languages when possible, to live our culture, to transmit information to our children, to understand our role in the cosmology of the world and within our Indigenous communities. We had a long discussion about the emphasis on your duties as well as your rights, that those two should complement one another and not be unduly focused on the right component. We had some members of our group that discussed, the best way to protect culture and sacred sites is to go to them and to reactivate them and to engage with them. And of course, the concept that political sovereignty ultimately comes from cultural sovereignty. A related subpoint to that was just to be open-minded about the differences between tribal cultures and Indigenous communities. Obviously, there's an enormous array of diversity, but also in the U.S. in particular to think about the complexities of reservation-based life versus the life of urban Indians, which is increasingly the experience of a lot of people in the United States anyway. The second big concept was to engage youth. There was a big emphasis put on transmitting information to youth, actively engaging young people, and reaching them both in traditional ways, traditional Indigenous ways, including those things that are culturally relevant in your community, songs, stories, ceremonies, but also engaging new technologies and really embracing other mediums to advance knowledge. When we discussed language, there was very much a feeling that that time is of the essence. Many Indigenous languages and many traditional cultural practices are threatened and could completely disappear within a generation. So we talked a lot about the responsibility of those who have this knowledge to transmit it to a younger generation, and also then conveying corresponding duties by young people to engage their culture and to learn their languages and their culture when possible. It's also worth mentioning that the Year of Indigenous Languages is coming up, and so there was discussion that there should be emphasis on that, maybe even a conference to convene to discuss, what we would like to see accomplished in that, and what would like to see come out of it. The third idea was to educate and share with outsiders. This builds on some of the comments that Dean and I had made early in the week, that really there's a real absence of education, certainly in the United States, and I assume around the world, of the history of colonization and the history of Indian people. Most people come out of school, in this country at least, without really understanding the concept of treaties or political sovereignty, without understanding the doctrine of discovery, without understanding colonization. As we discussed in our group, what we have found in personal experience is that when you can give people books to read and you can give them stacks of paper, but it's when people actually engage with Indigenous people and understand and experience some aspects of Indigenous culture that they really begin to feel those values and have that connection, and that when appropriate, it would be to our benefit to try to share more of who we are with outsiders. Number 4, people said we need more information about the United Nations. It's sort of a black box to a lot of people, including WIPO, because that's particularly relevant to what we were talking about, but trying to get information to Indigenous communities, making this information more accessible, more manageable. There was also some concern about insufficient information about processes, about insufficient notice for international events that make it difficult for Indigenous people to participate. There were some concerns about who represents themselves at the United Nations level and legitimacy in identifying indigeneity, particularly when relying only on self-identification as opposed to community identification. And finally, there was an emphasis on domesticating the Declaration into both Indigenous law, in Indigenous communities, and into federal law. Of course, building off of the comments of Walter Echo Hawk in his keynote yesterday, to really talk about concretely what it would look like to begin to dismantle colonial federal Indian law that has worked to undermine our communities here in the U.S. and Indigenous communities around the world. Thanks.
Thank you, Angela. And now we have Group 6, Education and Health, and I'm afraid I don't know who's speaking, but I see a gentleman coming right here.
My name's Sheldon Spotted Elk. I'm Northern Cheyenne, and I'm up here speaking on behalf because Auntie Chet Half Moon nominated me, and I accepted her nomination. So I'm reporting out on health and education. I have 12 points and a really great goat story about goat eye drops, and so so it's going to be great. Let me pull up my notes here. I'm sorry. All right, and so the preamble that I want to deliver, we had a really small and intimate group, so there's, but the best way to put it, I don't know, we just had limited participation. Most of the people in the room were from America, and we had a Kenyan doctor, and so that's where we're coming from, this perspective on our education and healthcare. As those that are tracking, you'll find in the drip, the Article 16 or 13 through 16 is kind of the areas that we're looking on education, and then 22 through 27 as far as health care. And so what we're talking about is, first is access to education and health care. Of course, there's new technology out there that's being able to access some of these services. And when we talk about education, of course, that's Indigenous education, that's Western education, if you want to bifurcate it in those ways. It's being able to utilize modern technologies, whether it be these fancy computers that we have in our pockets, all of us, or being able to transportation, telehealth, and those kind of technologies to be able to access that. We listed this as something immediate as ongoing. Everything, all these initiatives are immediate and ongoing that we should be doing in our communities. And of course, government has a role to play in this. Our tribal communities have a role to play in this. Our tribal leaders, those that are in American systems, have a role to play in this. And so next is data, disaggregating data, so we can make evidence-based policy decisions within our communities, whether that's regarding to healthcare or education, being able to help fill those gaps based upon data and not just shooting from the hip or anecdotes. And so that's really important for us to be able to address those. And we do see an area not only by governments, the academy, but also philanthropy and foundations being able to be educated based upon this data to be able to make the best utilization of their resources into tribal communities. Of course, there's a history about academies coming into tribal Indigenous communities and exploiting Indigenous communities. And so I think a lot of this, I'm going to reference this again, but the FUBU model, the played out American brand of clothing, for us, by us, it is also creating a pipeline for some of our academics that are Indigenous to be able to come and do this work in our communities. Sorry that some of you guys didn't catch that reference there. Those that grew up in the 90s probably are with me. So access to being able to utilize cross sections. And so this is where my goat story comes in, or not my goat story, the doctor's goat story from Kenya. Just being able to know our communities and realizing how these institutions collaborate with one another. The goat story is in some of these pastoral communities in Kenya, having a health clinic for a farmer to be able to access next to a veterinarian clinic would be knowing that community and being able to work together to be able to serve both the goat that might have an eye infection and the man that might have an eye infection as well. And so being able to utilize that and work across sectors, delivering services through technology. I talked to you a little bit about that. I think I spoke to that. Once again, community, there's a obligation to our governments in our Indigenous communities to be able to help provide infrastructure for these technologies to flourish. Using language and integrating Native perspectives within the academy, within our governments. I thought it was really insightful that this idea of using social science to be able to come into our community and maybe deal with these ideas of how does this particular Indigenous community deal with a sickness or an epidemic or something going through their community, and utilizing some of that social science to be able to address some of these things. And so another big point, and I felt like this was beautifully put, and as we had a presentation on Hawaiian language, the movement. It's called just the movement, and this movement of language revitalization, and having this family-based involvement when it comes to reaching out to the community. And of course, many of us that live in tribal communities and have grown up in tribal communities, that's how things are done. Separating from the individual versus the tribe, that kind of a concept. And I think it was really beautifully put in our group about being able to engage family-based involvement rather than just individuals. And of course, that's ongoing. Creating and communicating our message, and I think was articulated before, just as this is our public relations aspect of some of this, is being able to have a core message and being able to deliver that, whether it's around language revitalization or public health approaches to healthcare, being able to articulate that and streamline that so we could communicate that not only to our community members, but maybe to funders, to the Bill Gates Foundation or whatever, where we're trying to reach, or legislatures, and trying to reach them with our message, and having that core. Of course, that's utilizing that data is crucial as well. We also talked about grassroots as opposed to grass tops. Maybe some of us here are the grass tops, but being able to go back to our communities and being really active as far as utilizing the grassroots. I'm not even a law professor, and I ran over time. I can't believe this. So I am at time. So just being able to utilize the grassroots and being able to engage community members and making sure we can effectuate change on the highest level. So and integrating health and education at the core. So thank you.
Thank you. I am not going to try to summarize this rich discussion at all. This was fantastic. Thank you to all the speakers. There's one thing I do want to emphasize. Dean and I mentioned this yesterday, and that is the importance of public awareness raising, and the education on the Declaration. And from our perspective at the UN, if Indigenous peoples themselves are not aware of this and are not pushing for this, don't expect the UN then to do this. We need you to be pushing Indigenous peoples to be promoting and telling the UN at the country level, at the international level, that the Declaration needs to be implemented. And we'll do our best also to obviously work with the governments and to provide this information and to educate government officials. And I think, again, general public information, getting this into school curriculum, at the lowest, at all levels, including primary education, very important. And we look forward to continuing working with the University of Colorado. I want to thank Carla, Dean and I, and all of you for this. It's been amazing. So thank you for this fantastic workshop. We're not quite finished, huh? Somebody's coming.
Thank you very much for that, Brody, and all of you who gave your reports. Sorry about the delay here. I wasn't sure exactly when I was supposed to give my closing remarks. And they're not actually closing remarks. There are going to be 3 people talking after me, I understand. So we do things differently here. That's why we make a difference in the world, right? Like we told you at the very beginning. So anyway, I just want to add once more my thanks to all of those who have made this a very successful event, and everybody present who's contributed in one way or another. But just to mention a few of the people who have worked very hard to bring us all together in what has been a very successful event. Of course, Carla Friedrich, who's the master mind behind all of this, and has reached out to each one of our speakers in one way or another and managed to get them all here safely amid hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and such. And Kate Finn, who has worked very hard to put everything together, a fellow of our Indian Law program, and with her, Alex Kinsella, who assists me generally, but has worked very hard. Our IT staff has done a great job of helping everything run smoothly from a technical standpoint. You've all been to conferences and meetings where things have not worked. And by and large, they've worked greatly. So thanks to all our IT staff. And then a number of others that I'd like to mention, but really, if I start to go down the long list, I'm going to miss some folks. So just let me say to each of you who has had a role in this event, thank you so much for what you've done, the dedication you've shown to putting this together. And also thanks to the folks from this office, from not the Office High Commission, the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum, the United Nations Secretary of the Permanent Forum, Chandra Roy, and Brody Sugardarson, and I'm sorry I messed up your last name before, and I probably just messed it up again. So, guess where Brody's from? Oh, you gave it away. You didn't. I knew Brody for 10 years before I knew he was from Iceland. I thought he was from Ireland, but anyway. I heard Iceland, and I said Ireland, but no, he speaks with an Irish brogue. No, I really, the list is very long of folks to thank. Again, this has been a partnership or a joint joint effort by the University of Colorado Law School and the UN Secretariat for the Permanent Forum. And we've also had as a presenting sponsors, the Native American Rights Fund. I want to acknowledge John Echohawk and his team, the fantastic lawyers of NARF, and then once again recall for all of you the longstanding partnership that has existed between the University of Colorado Law School and NARF, and the commitment that represents to addressing indigenous issues and issues of justice more broadly. This is just one of the many examples of the kind of work we are doing here at the University of Colorado Law School to advance justice, and we're so privileged to have this partnership with NARF that is really part of the history of both organizations. And in that regard, let me mention the late David Getchus, who was the dean of the University of Colorado Law School and tragically passed away due to cancer. David was one of the founders of the Native American Rights Fund and a long-time faculty member of this law school before coming dean. He is one of the pioneers in the field of Indian law in this country, co-authored the first textbook on Indian law, and helped to forge forward with helping to make Indian law a regular part of the curriculum, not just of this law school, but of law schools across the country. David had a hand in this building. This was a project of his, and it was completed with, if you knew David, you'd see many of elements of his personality, and among them is the courtyard out here. And I won't go into all that I've learned about that courtyard, but one thing I do know about it was that David envisioned that courtyard as a place of gathering in a multicultural level, not just a place where heady law professors and a few law students would get together and talk about things legal in a sterile way, but in a way that would a gathering place that would bring people together in unique ways and in a cross-cultural way. When I first crossed that courtyard, I just thought to myself, this would be a great place for native dances and for a drum. And I'm so happy that I got to see that and be present for that yesterday when we had the dancers sharing with us and the drumming that I know warmed each one of our hearts. So I just want to acknowledge David's role in putting this together. He really did have a hand in introducing Indian law or indigenous peoples law to this law school, to the world, and in the events that have brought us all together today. So let me just finish my remarks. I'm not the last one to speak, so, but I do want to finish my remarks by recalling another great leader, and that is Oren Lyons, who, as many of you know, is an Onondaga chief who was very much involved in the effort to bring to the international stage the concerns of indigenous peoples. Professor Glenn Morris was here, mentioned the events in 1970s by which indigenous leaders from across the country went to the United Nations and really started the modern indigenous rights movement at the United Nations. Oren has been a great leader throughout the years and in inspiring many of the developments that have occurred. When I was named Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and gave my first presentation at a UN meeting, it was actually at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and I'd just been named a Special Rapporteur. He came up to me after I said a few feeble words and said, Jim, we have a lot of work to do. Remember, I mentioned this before. This was 2008. The declaration had just been adopted. So this is 2008. He comes to me and said, Jim, we have a lot of work to do, and he looked me straight in the eye, the wind is on our back. So I think that's what the spirit here that's prevailed at this meeting. We've seen before us a lot of work to do, but we know that in doing that work, the wind is on our back. Thank you.
I'm getting very used to being here and looking out at all of you, and I'm definitely going to miss that. So first of all, a very, very big thank you to all of you for coming here, for being with us. And I actually stopped in on all the 6 working groups, and the 6-minute presentations you had were fantastic, encapsulating everything. But the richness of the debate and the discussions that I listened to in each 6 of them, and all 6 were extremely different and diverse, yet very rich. So thank you all for participating at the plenary, but also especially at the working groups. And I noticed that the energy level was extremely high. There was a lot of enthusiasm, and there was a lot of commitment. Thank you very much for giving us the road ahead, the declaration by 2027. And I hope that this partnership that we've started on with the University of Colorado, with Dean Anaya, my old friend, is going to continue so that by 2027 we'll be able to meet here again. I hope you'll invite me because I will be long gone by then. But I hope that by 2027 that we'll have a lot more to say on how the declaration has been implemented. There's going to be peace everywhere. All Indigenous peoples are going to be safe, secure, have all their rights, right to self-determination, cultural identity. That is the dream that we all have. And thank you for articulating it so clearly in these 6 working groups that you had and identifying the strategies. To say thank you to the University of Colorado is an understatement, because for us from our small team, and you see my colleague from Iceland and myself, but we have a few others also at our office who are unable to come, and they also helped us put this together. So I wanted to also thank our colleagues. I don't know if they're watching on webcast, but to convey the thanks and appreciation from all our team at at New York, and also, of course, from DESA itself for this privilege of co-hosting this. And I hope we can plan that this is going to be something that will be carried forward in some way or the other, and that we will have this opportunity to bring it together. For myself personally, this was a wonderful space to reflect, to catch up with old friends, see the new ones that are there. I think it was Daly who said new blood, fresh blood. Thank you, Daly, for reminding us that we all need that. It was wonderful to see all this fresh new blood that is here as well. And also to just see where we are at. Sometimes when you're running, you don't know where you are because you're just running to keep up. And this was a wonderful time to just sit, reflect, and see that although sometimes we may get frustrated as we move ahead, and we see that they are also not just steps forward, but also steps back, but time to just see that, yes, we have made some advances, we have had some progress. And in that, I look at our expert members from the Permanent Forum, and I'd like to say thank you so much to Tarsila Rivera-Zea and to Les Maliser, who have traveled from far away, and especially Les from all the way down under to come here and be with us and share with us. Thank you very much. To the expert mechanism members, Professor Barume and Professor Kristen, I think she's saying. But also especially to our special rapporteur, and you are going to hear from her after this. But I want to say thank you very much. I hope we're going to see you again. And also that I hope when you go back home, you're going to have time to take forward this wonderful energy and enthusiasm that we have, as we have had for the last 2 days, and you're going to keep the energy alive and awake and going strong. So thank you all very much, Juju, and I hope we see you again. Thank you.
I feel very honored to be given this opportunity to also say a few words in our closing plenary. First, let me thank the University of Colorado, the American Indian Law Clinic, for inviting all of us here. I must say that even before Jim became the dean, I have already been here upon the invitation of the American Indian Law Clinic, Carla Fredericks and Narv. No, so I met them, I think 4 years ago. Yeah. So I feel there's a community here that can really work together. And for me, what this event tells me is that really we need to strengthen our partnership with the academic community, because they can really provide us a lot of support in the work that we are doing. When I became the special rapporteur, Carla Fredericks already approached me and asked me if I would like to avail of the services that they can offer. And of course, I said yes immediately. And they did help. In the visit that I did here in the United States, they were the ones who basically ran the whole visit and helped me develop the report that I made for the Human Rights Council, which I will be presenting next week in Geneva. And there will be some people from here, from Carla and from the Standing Rock Sioux community who will be there as well. So this event is a very important event. Before we were sort of wondering how the celebration of the 10th anniversary of the Declaration will take place. We were quite disappointed when the General Assembly just decided to hold it during the session of the Permanent Forum. We would have wanted it to happen, in September 13 at the General Assembly. And I think the efforts of Carla and Jim to bring this meeting here is really more productive, I think, because we do have time to really dig more deeply into what we think are the achievements of 10 years after the Declaration, as well as identify the challenges and the strategies that we need to do to be able to have a better implementation of the Declaration. I think that for me, if I look back and I think about what has been achieved, I think the UN Declaration has really been instrumental in making indigenous peoples more visible, at the domestic level as well as at the international level. Now, many UN processes, in the past they will ignore us, but now with the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, we are there. Indigenous peoples are mentioned there, whereas in the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals that was developed in 2005, we were not even mentioned. No, there are many, we are mentioned in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There's now a platform established for sharing of traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples on mitigation and adaptation. We are in the Convention on Biodiversity. So increasingly, I think, because of the declaration, we are able to really assert to these international bodies that they cannot simply ignore us. And so that, for me, is the biggest achievement. And I'd like to pick from what Jim has said, what Oren Lyons has said, that the wind is in our back. And I do believe that the wind is on our back, because we can indeed offer solutions to the problems that the world faces today, which will also solve the problems that we face. I think that we are on that path now. We are showing, there are many examples happening in our communities which will show that with or without the governments, we can still do what we need to do, because that is what is demanded of us by our peoples, by our ancestors, and by our future generations. So I'm very optimistic that we are going to climb, even up higher, and maybe, as Chandra said, by 2027, we will have different stories, more hopeful stories of how we have finally achieved our self-determined development. We are finally setting up our own governance systems that will run in parallel, or maybe even without the nations, the state agencies, etc. And that is what it needs to be. We need to really show that we can do it in another way. And among all the different peoples in the world today, I can't think of anybody else but indigenous peoples who will be able to show that cutting edge. We have traditional knowledge, and our traditional knowledge is valued. But I also believe that our traditional knowledge is modern knowledge. We cannot say that it's a knowledge that belongs to the past. It's a very modern type of knowledge that we will be able to use to solve many of the problems that we are facing. So again, thank you very much. Thank you to Jim, thank you to Carla, thank you to Narf, and thank you to you all for coming here. I think that the community, it always makes me happy to come to meetings like this, because I know we will be meeting each other, and we sort of have become a big global family, and that is the source of our strength as peoples as well. Thank you.
I meant to ask Vicky before to do what I just asked her to do. That is to give us a song.
A little song.
She has many talents, and one is her singing in her native language. And I thought that would be an appropriate way to end our gathering. Adding to the other songs you've heard, including from Walter Egohawk yesterday evening, and now Vicky. Before that, though, I said there are many people that deserve thanks for all the effort put into bringing us together. I didn't see her before in the room, but I just did. Julianne Williams, who is so key. So thank you, Julianne, to getting us all together. So, Vicky.
Okay. Well, I'll just do one of the chants that we do every time we come together as Igorots. And this is a chant that we can just compose words and bring it together to fit the occasion that we are singing in. So here goes. Dang dang ay si dung ilay, in sinali duma ay la 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 lay. Dang dang ay si dung ilay, pala lalunan gasing mi, naay dadlu in mali, nan ka ipu-ipugaw, dangdang ay si dung ilay, dangdang ay si dung ilay, insinali duma ay lalilalay, dung ilay si dung ilay.
That's it. That's it for us. Go in peace, everybody.